This is Robert Morris. I'm with Professor Walter Kaufmann, and for the next several minutes we're going to be discussing existentialism. Professor Kaufmann, I'd like to start things off by suggesting that the term existentialism is very widely misunderstood. And I'm wondering if you might want to comment on that as a beginning to our conversation.
I think there are good reasons for sometimes wondering whether there really is any such thing as existentialism. The person who coined that ism word, existentialism, was Jean-Paul Sartre, the great French writer, and he popularized the term right after World War II. And no sooner had he coined the word and won a great deal of attention all over the world than the two leading German existentialists, Martin Heidegger and Jaspers, both said that if Sartre was an existentialist, they were not. Not only did they both dislike Sartre somewhat, but by that time they'd also come to dislike each other quite a lot. At one time, in the 1920s, they had been friends, and there had been some mutual stimulation, but partly for political reasons, during the Nazi period, they had become estranged, and by the time when Jean-Paul Sartre won international attention, they both felt that their differences were infinitely more important than anything they might have in common, either with each other or with him. The fourth writer, besides Sartre and Heidegger and Jaspers, who is very widely considered an existentialist and one of the seminal figures of the existentialist movement, is the Danish writer Søren Kierkegaard, who was born in 1813 and died in 1855. Those who have read him would agree, I think, that if he had still been living in 1945, 1946, he too would have felt that if Sartre was an existentialist, he was not one. He too would have felt that his differences with Sartre far outweighed any similarities. It has often been remarked that he made fun of German philosophy in his time. Again, I think that if he had been living in the 1940s, he probably would have found Heidegger especially even funnier than the German philosophers of whom he made fun in his day. So that in the light of all this, one might come to the conclusion that existentialism is a term that could be applied only to Sartre's philosophy and not to anybody else's. But things are still worse than I've indicated so far. Sartre in 1945-46 rather liked to think of himself as an existentialist, but subsequently he became more and more interested in Marxism, and by 1961, in his Search for a Method, which has been published in English translation too, he described Marxism as the philosophy of our time and disparaged existentialism as merely a parasitical phenomenon on the margins of knowledge, and by knowledge he meant Marxism. So even Sartre now no longer particularly likes that term for his own philosophy. And under these circumstances, one might wonder whether the term is useful at all. I still think it has some usefulness, provided one uses it sensibly. Ism words in philosophy are generally suspect, and nevertheless worth using with caution. One does speak of British empiricism, and it's what one might call an elegant variation for saying Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. Sometimes one refers to these three philosophers as the British empiricists. And sometimes, instead of saying Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, one says the continental rationalists. And sometimes, instead of saying Peirce and James and Dewey, one says the American pragmatists. And in every one of these cases, these men consider their differences much more important than anything that they might have had in common. But this is precisely why the term is useful. Why the ism terms have some legitimate use. If a man defines his contribution to philosophy very largely in terms of his differences with a predecessor, then in order to understand him, one also has to study his predecessor. And so to understand what makes Spinoza important, one has to know something about Descartes. In order to understand what makes Leibniz important, one has to know something about both Descartes and Spinoza. As long as 3 or 4 people are best studied together, because to understand their distinctive contributions, one has to compare them, it is quite useful to have a label for linking them all, and that is the legitimate use of ism words. So I would say that it makes good sense to use the word existentialism for primarily Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Jaspers, and Sartre, as long as we don't suppose that they all agree and that they all have the same philosophy, which they do not. Of course, that raises the question whether there is anything interesting that they do have in common. There needn't be. The term would be useful even if they didn't, but I think there is something that they all have in common. Now, I think what I've said so far is really not particularly controversial. I think people who are at home in the literature would probably agree this far. But when we raise the question as to what Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Jaspers, and Sartre have in common, I think different people would make different suggestions. And I'd like to comment on one suggestion that I think is at best half true, but that is also half false, and point out what's wrong with it before I make a suggestion of my own that I believe will stand up rather better. The half-true suggestion that doesn't stand up too well is that what the existentialists have in common is that they are somehow closer to existence, closer to real life, that they are less academic. The assumption is that most philosophers, including most English-speaking philosophers, after all wrote books that are mostly for philosophy professors or graduate students or perhaps sometimes undergraduates as well, while the existentialists supposedly have written for a much larger audience and are less academic and closer to real-life problems. As I say, there is some truth in that, but there's also something wrong with that. Anyone who has tried to read the major philosophical works, even of Kierkegaard, and quite especially of Heidegger and Jaspers and Jean-Paul Sartre, works like Heidegger's Being and Time and Sartre's Being and Nothing, must be struck by the fact that these are books that really are for philosophy professors and graduate students and very, very hard to understand, while much of Locke and Berkeley and Hume and John Stuart Mill and Bertrand Russell is really much easier to understand. So something must be wrong with this suggestion. Nevertheless, there's some element of truth in it. Now, my own suggestion tries to bring out the element of truth. It is that these so-called existentialist philosophers agree about what is the best starting point for philosophical reflection. I think they all, 4 of them, and some other philosophers who in this respect are close to them as well, believe believe that the best starting point for philosophical reflection is what is sometimes called ultimate situations or extreme situations. They are sort of almost intense experiences. One word for them would be Jaspers' German term Grenzsituationen, which means literally border situations. The preeminent example would be the experience of our own death, when we are not actually dying, but when we are, so to say, sweating out our death in anticipation. Sweating it out, expecting that very soon we are going to die. Illustrations of this are common in existentialist literature. For example, Jean-Paul Sartre's short story, The Wall, but also in some of Sartre's plays, this is a prominent motif. We have the same sort of thing in Sartre's philosophical work, where he deals with this experience of one's own death, where one doesn't just think that one dies, or that one must die, or that all men are mortal, but when one anticipates one's own death very really, very existentially. We have the same concern a little earlier in Heidegger's philosophical work, and of course it is also familiar to us from Camus' novels. The stranger, the hero or anti-hero of the book, through much of the book, is in prison and looks forward to his own execution. In Camus' second novel, The Plague, a whole city is struck by the plague, and the people in that city live with the very immediate anticipation of their own death. So this is one kind of extreme situation. Others would be what Kierkegaard called, in the title of one book, Fear and Trembling, in the title of another book, Dread. This dread, this anxiety, is a very central motif in existentialist literature, including the philosophical works of the existentialists. And a third motif would be what Kierkegaard calls in the title of another book, The Sickness Unto Death, which is despair. And to give just one more example, the guilt feelings. Now these are, according to the existentialists, the best starting point for philosophical reflection. In case some of you should wonder, well, what else? Isn't that the obvious way for a philosopher to start? The answer is that the continental rationalists and the British empiricists and the American pragmatists did not start philosophical reflection from experiences like these at all. So here we do have something distinctive, and this starting point is indeed closer to real life and is less academic and less limited in appeal than what many other philosophers do. But in their philosophical discussions of these experiences, of problems raised by these experiences, some of these men, notably Sartre himself and Heidegger, become extremely obscure, extremely technical, and as I've said before, sometimes right in a way that is the despair even of professors and graduate students. If my suggestion is accepted, it has some rather interesting implications. The question is often asked whether existentialism can be traced back to people long, long before Kierkegaard, long before the 19th century. The question is often asked whether, in some sense, perhaps Pascal already was an existentialist, whether perhaps St. Augustine was an existentialist, and whether still much earlier, possibly the author of the book of Job in the Bible did some existentialist writing. And once you invite this sort of question, the sky is the limit, and one may ask about vast numbers of writers where the term should not be applied to them also. And my answer to this would be that the kind of experience that I have described, extreme experiences, ultimate situations, border situations, have been a staple of literature and religion for thousands of years. Indeed, there is one form of literature, tragedy, that perhaps by definition always deals with such situations. And I don't think that it is particularly profitable to call the Greek tragic poets or Shakespeare existentialists. I myself have written a book from Shakespeare to existentialism, in which I deal with Shakespeare, and then later on in the book also with some of the existentialists, but there's no implication that it would be particularly useful to call Shakespeare himself an existentialist, and indeed I think it would not. What is distinctive about the existentialists is that material, experiences, motifs that had been central in religion and in literature for thousands of years, here suddenly become a starting point for philosophy. And therefore, if it hadn't been for Heidegger and Jaspers and Sartre, I don't think that any of us would think of Kierkegaard as an existentialist. Perhaps we would not even think of him as a philosopher, but rather we would think of him as he thought of himself as a Christian, a religious writer. And he dealt with motifs that had been a staple of much Christian literature before his time. What is distinctive is that in the 20th century, a number of professional philosophers have decided that the sort of thing that Kierkegaard did was a very reasonable thing for philosophers to do also, and for that it was in the 20th century that existentialism was born. Hence the question about various playwrights, contemporary playwrights, or novelists, whether they are existentialist writers is, to my mind, a misguided question, because the term should not be applied, I think, to mainly literary or religious figures. It is a term that should be applied mainly to philosophers in the way that I have suggested.
Professor Kaufmann, you suggested that, in effect, there is no such thing as a school of existentialism, and that existentialism is itself a repudiation of collective doctrines. So I'd like to ask you then, if in fact the heart of existentialism, as you've written yourself, is anti-school, anti-dogmatic, anti-doctrinal, how then are we to differentiate the various philosophers whom you've named?
The number of ways in which one could answer this question. There are a number of things that come together here. First of all, one might say that none of the major philosophers has belonged to a school, that anybody who belongs to a school, that anybody who is mainly a follower is eo ipso not a major philosopher, not a major figure in his own right. And the really important philosophers are none of them members of schools. That would be true of all the ones that I have mentioned so far. That would be one consideration. Secondly, it so happens that the particular four people that I've mentioned as existentialists, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Jaspers, and Sartre, are all four very individualistic figures. This is very striking in the case of Kierkegaard, who once wrote that the epitaph that he would prefer for himself would be that individual. And one of the very appealing and intriguing things about Jean-Paul Sartre is that he is also so very much, despite some of his doctrinal opinions, an arch-individualist. So this would be the second consideration. Temperamentally, the so-called existentialists are averse to schools. And then thirdly and lastly, I might say that what these four men have in common, in connection with the extreme, ultimate situations that I have described, is a preoccupation with man in his loneliness, with man in utter solitude. And not only are they interested in reflecting on man in such solitude, but they themselves feel that to be authentic, I'm using a word that has been much used by the existentialists themselves, to be authentic, man must achieve solitude, he must somehow stand by himself. And since they are all four men who are trying to be authentic, since they're all four men who are trying not to really drown in the anonymous they, in the public one, doing what one does, doing what one is supposed to do, they are, for that reason, too, averse to being members of a school and very individual figures.
Now, when you mention solitude, do you mean both isolation and individuality or self-definition, or do you mean both?
I think I mean both. This, of course, leaves open the other question that you asked before. How can one divide them up? Here we have four people. How might one group them? Might one, among these four, still possibly find two groups of two each, for example? Jean-Paul Sartre, in his lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, made a very ill-advised and hasty attempt to do just that. It's worth mentioning because it has been quite influential. He suggested that confusion has arisen from the fact that there are, as he says, two kinds of existentialism, Christian and atheist. And then he goes on to say, this was in 1946, that examples of Christian existentialism are Kierkegaard, which is fair enough, and Jaspers, whom Sartre goes on to call Roman Catholic, which is simply a mistake. Jaspers had never been a Roman Catholic. He was brought up a Protestant, but his own position would be much more that of an agnostic than that of a Christian. So this is really not quite accurate. And then what Sartre suggested was that on the other hand, there were Heidegger and himself, who were atheists, and Heidegger was not particularly happy about being called an atheist, though one would hardly call him a theist. This way of dividing up the cake seems to me very unhelpful indeed.
Professor Kaufmann, the Christian concept of atonement, if we choose to see it as such, is an at-one-ment with God. Now, would it therefore be possible for a person to be both a Christian and an existentialist, and to see this individuality or this isolation, this ultimate individuality, as being a shared oneness with God? And
before it is possible, and this is, of course, what Kierkegaard tried to do. And it seems to me that if we use the word existentialism at all, we clearly should include Kierkegaard. If you will, he was the father of existentialism. I've said that existentialism really came into its own in the 20th century, but it goes back to him very much. He gave it decisive impulses. Is very important for this whole movement, and he wanted desperately to be a Christian in the highest and most demanding sense of the word, and he felt that to be a Christian within Christendom was devilishly hard, that precisely because there were so many Christians, so-called Christians, lip service Christians, shallow Christians, it was extremely difficult to achieve the state of being a Christian in the more demanding sense. And he felt that this called for extreme solitude, for becoming an individual all alone. Now one might say, as long as one believes in God, one really isn't all alone. Nietzsche suggested that he had achieved the kind of solitude that people who had still believed in God could not even understand. And Nietzsche, in turn, also exerted a decisive influence on existentialism, not on Kierkegaard, of course. Kierkegaard died when Nietzsche was 11 years old, but Nietzsche had an immense influence on Heidegger, who has written several essays as well as a big 2-volume work on him, on Jaspers, who has written on him again and again, including a couple of books, and also on Jean-Paul Sartre. And in Nietzsche too, as I've said, you find this tremendous emphasis on the need for breaking with the crowd, the need for breaking with the herd, and of achieving authenticity all by oneself.
Your comments about Christian existentialism, as you very carefully explained what you meant by that term, immediately makes me think of Dostoevsky, who not only in Notes from the Underground, but I'm particularly thinking of the brothers Karamazov and in Crime and Punishment, two of his novels in which he suggests very much the same thing, the tremendous importance of a purification of self, of a definition of self, and that out of this comes a concept of Christianity which is very forceful, but it requires along the way a tremendous amount of suffering, a tremendous amount of self-examination, a peeling away of worldly facades and poses and self-deceptions. So could we, for a few moments, or could you for a few moments, comment on the concept of Christianity, which we find in someone like Dostoevsky, who seems to be approaching this question of self-deception, this question of self-purification, in very much the same way that Kierkegaard did.
One thing that's important to keep in mind before we talk about Dostoevsky, and I'm happy to talk about him, is that for various reasons, some of which I've mentioned earlier, it would, to my mind, be a mistake and unfruitful to call Dostoevsky an existentialist. Similarly, I would not call Nietzsche an existentialist any more than I would call Aristotle a Thomist. No Thomism without Aristotle, but that doesn't make Aristotle a Thomist. No existentialism without Nietzsche, but that doesn't make Nietzsche an existentialist. But I will come back to Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky had a great influence on 20th century existentialism, and so, incidentally, also did Tolstoy. And before we talk about Dostoevsky now, it is well to keep in mind that one of the distinctive things about 20th century existentialism is that it is a movement against positivism. Positivism consists largely in philosophers, and for that matter people in some of the other humanities, modeling themselves on the sciences, making science the norm. That is the essence of positivism. And existentialism is very much against that. And it is prophetic in a way when Kierkegaard calls one of his major works, concluding unscientific postscript. When he spoke of unscientific, he was not only thinking of the natural sciences, but also of Hegel's boast, the German philosopher's boast, that he had elevated philosophy to the rank of a science. But a certain bias against science is built into 20th century existentialism, and particularly strong in the work of Martin Heidegger. And it is important, I think, to realize that although Heidegger is not a theist, while Kierkegaard was so Christian, in very important respects, Heidegger is really very, very close to Kierkegaard. Now, one thing that distinguishes 20th century existentialism is not only a certain bias against science, but also a strong feeling that philosophy really is closer to literature, and quite especially to poetry, than it is to the sciences. And what goes together with this strong affinity for literature is, of course, in the case of Jean-Paul Sartre, a great literary genius, the gift to really write great literature, which Sartre has done again and again in various genres. But what goes with it too is that Sartre, as well as Jaspers and Heidegger and some other writers who are in some respects close to them, have been very much influenced by various literary figures. And among these literary figures, Dostoevsky is very important. Now, there are a number of motifs in Dostoevsky that have had considerable influence, and I don't think that as far as the existentialist writers are concerned, it was anything that has very much to do with his Christianity. I think that Dostoevsky's strong Christian convictions have not been that influential on Jaspers or Heidegger or Sartre. Perhaps not at all. But one thing that's very striking about Dostoevsky, not so much perhaps to somebody who is young now and takes that sort of thing for granted, but what was very striking for these writers is Dostoevsky's psychological acuteness. Nietzsche first discovered Dostoevsky in 1887, quite fortuitously, by chance, picking up a book. It was Notes from Underground, a French translation, in a bookstore. And then, in the following year, writing one of his own books, he referred to Dostoevsky with great admiration and called him the only psychologist, by the way, who had something to teach me. And this, I think, is what helps to account for Dostoevsky's great influence on 20th century existentialism, his psychological insights. And that, incidentally, goes for Tolstoy, too. Tolstoy's short story, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, so much anticipates some of what the existentialists have been saying about man sweating out his own death, that I would say that Heidegger in particular, in his discussion of death in his major philosophical work, Being and Time, offers us an unacknowledged commentary on The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy. He does once in passing mention this work, but he does not make explicit how great his indebtedness is to it. And what we find even outside The Death of Ivan Ilyich in Tolstoy is, in Anna Karenina, for example, a masterful understanding of the mechanisms of self-deception. I have tried to bring this out in the long introduction to an anthology I've done, Religion from Tolstoy to Camus, published in paperback by Harper Torch Books. And there I try to show in some detail how in Anna Karenina we do find a really profound understanding of self-deception and document how this is one of the motifs that runs through the book. Now, this is very relevant in connection with existentialism because self-deception is one of the main motifs in Jean-Paul Sartre's work. He uses the French phrase mauvaise foi, literally bad faith, but this is all but indistinguishable from self-deception. And he does not only discuss this in his Being and Nothingness, in which a whole chapter deals with mauvaise foi, with bad faith, but of course he also offers a very intricate anatomy of bad faith in his plays and in his short stories and in his novels. And while perhaps nowhere in Dostoevsky do we find really something quite as persistent on this theme as we do, I think, in Anna Karenina. Dostoevsky is another writer from whom one can learn a tremendous amount about the psychological subtleties of self-deception.
I didn't mean to suggest earlier that Dostoevsky was an existentialist any more than I would suggest that in, let's say, King Lear, where Lear races out into the heath. He's going mad, and he pulls away his clothes. He tries to strip away his mortality. I don't mean to suggest in citing that situation that either Shakespeare or King Lear is an existentialist. But what intrigues me, and I think what intrigues my students, is the process of self-examination. And earlier in our conversation, you were talking about the four philosophers and their starting point. And it seems to me that so many things that you have said to this point suggest that the process of self-inquiry, whether the ultimate recognition is a recognition of God or the recognition of no God, either way, whatever the conclusion might be, nevertheless, man himself undergoes this process of self-examination. He undergoes this stripping away of certain vestiges of his humanity to get to his essential humanity. That deception is part of humanity, self-deception and deception of others. So could I come back to this point just a little bit further and ask you to comment on the process by which man, whether it is man in Dostoevsky's view or man in Heidegger's view or whoever, by which man seeks to explore himself, certainly not a new idea, and what conclusions he reaches about other men, having once examined himself.
Persistent self-examination clearly is not a sufficient condition for calling anybody an existentialist. I have no doubt that some people would like only too well calling Oedipus Tyrannus in Sophocles' great play, also called King Oedipus, an existentialist figure, but I would not. Here we have the stripping away of layers of misapprehension and an attempt to finally recognize what one is oneself, but I would say that does not make him an existentialist. A very clear example that this is not enough to make somebody an existentialist would be Sigmund Freud. Actually, Freud is the man who has done more than any other single human being to usher in an era in which all of us are aware of the ubiquity of self-deception, in which all of us realize how difficult it is to be honest with oneself. And Freud has given us more guidance than anybody else toward really understanding ourselves. But we don't therefore call Freud an existentialist. As I've suggested before, what is distinctive in existentialism is that all this is considered the best starting point for philosophy. And so what makes Jaspers and Heidegger and Sartre existentialists is that this is for them the starting point, but from there they go on to develop philosophies. And these philosophies are somewhat different in all three cases. Still, I think one distinction that I have already mentioned, that all of them probably also have in common, is that between inauthenticity and authenticity, they all in one way or another distinguish between the inauthenticity, the ungenuineness, the self-deception of the existence that characterizes the lives of people who conform, of people who are members of a crowd, and all of them in one way or another appeal to the reader, appeal to us to become nonconformists, to understand ourselves better, and to achieve a different form of existence. To this extent, I think it would be fair to say that all the existentialists are in some sense moralists. I'm sure that Martin Heidegger would be very unhappy with that suggestion. He certainly doesn't consider himself a moralist, and it is very striking that not one of the three existentialists of the 20th century has managed to write any book on ethics. None of them has managed to give us a morality. Nevertheless, one of the implications of their work is very definitely, one of the preoccupations of their work is very definitely to draw this distinction between a mode of existence that they disapprove of and that they want us somehow to become dissatisfied with, and another kind of existence that they consider possible and that they want to make us aware of and that they consider superior.
Professor Kaufmann, I find that a particularly interesting point, and I would like to ask you now how you explain the fact that they are so disinclined to be prescriptive.
I think there are two things probably that come together here. These very philosophers, who are widely considered so unacademic and in some ways anti-academic, closer to real life, are really all, in some ways, all too professorial. They are really competing, in a way, with Hegel, against whom Kierkegaard revolted, and trying to do the sort of thing that Hegel did, trying to do the sort of thing, in Heidegger's case, that Kant did. And what they feel one must do, being a philosopher, is write about being. To be sure, Heidegger says that philosophy has gone off the right track and that philosophers have not dealt sufficiently with being, and that his kind of science of being, that his kind of ontology is different from our previous ontology, that it is fundamental ontology. But still what it comes down to is that they feel that they have to tell us in some sense about being. And so they present the contrast between two ways of being, between two modes of existence, as if it were an explication of the nature of being, as if it were more metaphysics than ethics. They are in a way concerned to be very respectable, more respectable than Nietzsche was. They are in a way bidding to be taken very seriously in graduate seminars, to be discussable by professionals. And so even the ethical insights, and I'm not speaking of Kierkegaard here, but of Heidegger and of Jaspers and of Sartre, the ethical insights are presented as if they were a kind of metaphysics. This is one consideration. Now the other one is somewhat different. Sartre did actually want to give us a book on ethics, but he didn't get very far. And the reason he didn't get very far is, in a nutshell, that he didn't properly understand the nature of responsibility. And I don't think that any of the other existentialists, not Kierkegaard, not Jaspers, not Heidegger, have understood the nature of responsibility. In the first place, having stressed so much that we should break with the crowd, that we should not conform, that we should be authentic, they are driven toward what I would call an extreme subjectivism. What they have spurned is the crowd. What they have spurned is the anonymous one, the anonymous they. What they have exhorted us to be is individuals. What they've exhorted us to be is resolute, to choose with a will, to be authentic. And now the painful question arises, does anything go then, as long as it is chosen with a will? As long as it is chosen very resolutely. And here they shy back from the consequences of their own position. It seems to point toward moral anarchy and also toward intellectual anarchy. It seems to point in the direction of saying, to thine own self be true, and what you do then really doesn't make any difference, because as long as you are true to yourself, as long as you are authentic, as long as you are truly different from other people and realize yourself, anything you do will be fine. But they cannot really quite accept that conclusion, and they feel in their bones, or Sartre in his famous lecture on existentialism as a humanism quite explicitly, that this would be irresponsible. And now they are wondering, how can they introduce into this kind of extremely subjectivist ethic some notion of responsibility? And here they do not succeed. And because they do not succeed, because they are unable to tell us what would constitute a responsible choice, how to draw the line between a choice that would be responsible and that they could truly respect and an irresponsible one, they have been unable to give us an ethic. And so they do not get beyond exhortations to be resolute, to be authentic. There is no content. And I'm saying it is not because the content troubles them, but because they have no criteria for distinguishing between an irresponsible decision and a responsible one. Now what happens at this point, in the case of all of these existentialists, least so in the case of Jaspers, but in the case of all the others, is that sooner or later they cast about for some kind of authority to save them from moral anarchy. And in Kierkegaard, the authority, of course, was there, ready-made all along. It is Christianity. It is the scriptures. It is the Christian tradition. But the way he turns back to Christianity is rather original, is rather unusual. He does not take his ethic from the Lutheran State Church of Denmark. On the contrary, that church he attacks. As I've said, he finds it very, very difficult to be a Christian in the demanding sense of the word, in a society in which everybody is a Christian. So the state church becomes the enemy. But nevertheless, the Christian tradition holds authority. So what Kierkegaard ends up by doing is reading his own ideas, his own interpretation into Christian texts, into the Christian tradition, and then he gets it back endowed with authority. He claims to interpret, but he interprets somewhat arbitrarily, and now what he gets back is no longer just his ideas, which are very personal, which might enable you to say, yes, these are your ideas and here are mine. No, his ideas being presented by him as exegeses of the Christian tradition come back with all the authority of the Christian tradition. We get the same sort of thing in Martin Heidegger. In Heidegger it is all much more literary because he is estranged from religion. He reads his ideas first into the German poet Hölderlin. He wrote a number of exegeses of Hölderlin, eventually collected in a book. And then, in his most mature phase, he wrote lots and lots of exegeses of the pre-Socratic philosophers where, and he himself admits that an interpreter must use Gewalt, must use violence, must use force. He reads his own ideas into the pre-Socratics. He builds up the pre-Socratic philosophers, the earliest philosophers of the West, in such a way that we feel considerable reverence for them. And then, when he reads his ideas into them, he gets them back endowed with authority. And the same sort of thing I think we find in Jean-Paul Sartre. I've mentioned that he feels less enthusiastic about his own term existentialism now, that he considers Marxism the philosophy of our time. But the Marxism of Jean-Paul Sartre is very much like the Christianity of Kierkegaard. He too reads his own ideas into Marxism and then gets them back endowed with authority. Marxism, says he, is the philosophy of our time. Why should it be? Well, he is building it up, he is giving it authority, he is endowing it with authority, And then when he reads his own ideas into it and explicates Marxism, his own philosophy suddenly is no longer something that is purely subjective, but it is the philosophy of our time. And here we have, I think, let me just mention one more thing. Here, I think, we have a striking example of bad faith, of mauvaise foi, of self-deception on the part of the leading existentialists themselves. They are looking for authenticity, they're trying to overcome self-deception, but they themselves fall victim to self-deception, and what they do in the end is inauthentic.
Well, this was the point I was going to ask about, because it seems to me that if you're talking about the authority of the self, you could indeed lead to a moral anarchy. And a sincere and genuine concern for moral anarchy, a desire for an alternative to moral anarchy, then would logically lead to an extension of the authority of self to an institution of some form with which the individual identifies. And what you've just described is a redefinition of an institution by an individual to preserve the authority of oneself, but to support it with the authority of an institution. And it seems to me that the authority of the institution is contradictory to the authority of the self, that the true existentialist is by his very nature an individual, fulfilled, a self-defined individual, and that he will by his very uniqueness not be able to identify himself with an institution. I mean, isn't there a contradiction here?
Well, as you see, I'm not speaking of the true existentialist. I'm not using the word existentialist in any particularly laudatory way. I'm simply using it, as I said in the beginning I would, as a label for particular thinkers. And it seems to me that what they are doing here is interesting and open to very severe criticism. What's interesting about it is that they don't really, in the end, find authority in an institution. That would be much less interesting. That would be much more commonplace. But Kierkegaard does not make his peace with the church. On the contrary, he wears himself out peddling pamphlets in which he attacks the church, collapses in the street, is carried in 1855 into a hospital. He wants the last sacraments. He is offered them by an ordained minister of the state church, and although he badly wants the sacraments, he dies without them rather than compromise with the institution. Similarly, Jean-Paul Sartre, characteristically and importantly, does not join the Communist Party, does not feel that he can really join any major institution, feels that he has to stand alone. Heidegger briefly in 1933, when Hitler came to power, joined the Nazi Party, but certainly what is characteristic for Heidegger is again the stands that he took alone after this brief, unfortunate, and to me very unpalatable flirtation with Nazism. He took his stands alone. It is never really a way of making any enduring peace with an institution, but what goes on is the subtle maneuver of what I call exegetical thinking. It is a subtle maneuver in which the thinker casts about for some prop to lean on, and, being a man of words, finds a text, and then reads his own ideas in a very subjective way into the text, but as I've said, gets them back endowed with authority. And I'm not trying to say that this sort of exegetical thinking is confined to existentialism, but it is very interesting that people who start out so much as individualists and subjectivists and as enemies of bad faith and self-deception, in the end are driven into this kind of maneuver. I have tried to analyze this much more fully than I have done in these few words now in my book Above Guilt and Fear, an Autonomous Morality. The word is phobia calls, I suppose, for some explanation, since I myself coined it. What I mean by it is the dread people have of making fateful decisions that will mold their own character and their future. And the existentialists, in a kind of a way, may be said to be aware of this dread, but alas, they also themselves suffer very much from this dread, and in the end, as I have tried to show, succumb to it. In the end, they do not manage to stand all alone and to examine carefully and critically their own position, as well as the alternatives that are open to them. But in the end, they shut their eyes. In their earlier phase, they are drawn to the extreme subjectivism of saying just choose anything as long as you choose it with a will. This doesn't involve considering the objections to one's own preferences. This doesn't involve taking a critical look at one's own convictions and preferences, nor does it entail any careful examination of alternatives. And then later on, when they descend into exegetical thinking and read their own ideas into the text and get them back endowed with authority, again, what they're doing is something that stops short of looking with open eyes at one's own position and at various alternatives. A quotation that I like very much is to be found in Nietzsche's notebooks. Then Nietzsche once jotted down the following thought: a very popular error to have the courage of one's convictions, but what matters is to have the courage for an attack on one's convictions. And it seems to me that this very rare courage, the existentialist thinkers, alas, lack.
Professor Kaufmann, what do you foresee as being the legacy of the thinkers you have discussed and the works, the authors and works which you've discussed?
I don't suppose that their legacy ultimately will be some one or two or three particular ideas, but since they're all writers, probably some books. In the case of Karl Jaspers, perhaps an important part of his legacy will be that he did coin a word for those extreme situations of which are made so much, and called them Grenzsituationen. And by coining a word for them, border situations, he moved them clearly into focus. How much anything of Heidegger's will last, I am not sure. I suppose if anything lasts, it will be his book Being in Time, which I suppose will continue to be discussed somewhat by philosophy professors for some time to come. But the great legacy of existentialism, I would think, certainly if we confine ourselves to 20th century existentialism, will be in the non-philosophical works of Jean-Paul Sartre. I think that he is one of the great writers of our time, and I would expect that some of his plays and his 5 short stories, and perhaps at least one of his novels, will last, and I think they deserve to last. And I expect that Sartre will go down in history like some other French figures before him, Montaigne, for example, and Rousseau and Voltaire, as not straight philosophers, but as people who were somewhere on the borderline between philosophy and literature. That is perhaps more a French phenomenon than an American one. Finally, there is still one thing about Sartre that strikes me as very significant about him, and that is that more than any other single individual in our time, I suppose he has spoken to the conscience of intellectuals, not only in his own country, in France, but all over the world, appealing quite especially to writers, artists, students, and professors to speak out against injustices, and particularly against war crimes committed by their own governments. He did that all during the Algerian War, and I rather expect that he reached the conscience of very large numbers of people in the United States also, that the American reaction to the war in Vietnam owes a great deal to the influence of Jean-Paul Sartre.
This has been an informal conversation with Professor Walter Kaufmann, and my name is Robert Morris.